Thank you for joining Carla 2020. My name is Melissa Silverstein, and I am the founder and publisher of Women and Hollywood, an initiative that educates, advocates, and agitates for gender parity and inclusion in Hollywood and the global film industry. I am extremely honored to be one of the moderators and program advisors for Carla 2020. Big thanks to Helene Granqvist and Regina Mosch of WIFTY for coordinating this event. Before we hear from our guest today, Tori Amos, I just wanted to share the values of Carla 2020 and a pledge that we're upholding and that all participants have to sign and commit to upon registering for this conference. The pledge lays down some of the ground rules of anti-discrimination, mutual respect, and cultural safety. Our speakers do not and will not condone any forms of discrimination by themselves or perpetrated by others on the basis of ethnicity, religion, geographical origin, skin color, religious beliefs, sexuality, gender identity, socioeconomic class, disability, or age. Our speakers declare that they do not and will not tolerate sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, ableism, fascism, and other isms. Whatever those isms are, they will have no place at Carla 2020. And I am more than certain that our guests today are more than cognizant of the values embedded in that statement. But we as a conference felt that it was important to reiterate that our spaces of dialogue should above all be safe spaces. I want to affirm that Black Lives Matter, and in the wake of the pandemic, which laid bare structural inequalities across the world for marginalized groups and the global uprising against racism, this subject matter has now more than ever in recent history a sense of urgency. So here we go. Our guest today is the legendary singer-songwriter Tori Amos. She is a Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter, which I already said, pianist, composer, and with Ann Powers, the New York Times bestselling author of Tori Amos Piece by Piece. She has released 15 studio albums, and her latest book is Resistance, which she released earlier this year. Welcome, Tori.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Melissa.
I'm super excited to talk to you because, I knew your music, but then I was reading your, political treatise in this new book, and I was just super inspired to have this conversation with you in this moment in our world where we're all thinking about politics. And last night here in the United States, we're recording this on Tuesday, August 19th. Was the first night of the Democratic National Convention. And I know on my mind, and I would imagine on your mind, is a lot about how we save our country.
Yes.
And so let's just start a little bit by talking about how politics is a theme that is woven through your life and your art. Why is that such an important thing for you?
Well, I started professionally playing in Washington, D.C. at a young age, 13, and I moved to 3 blocks from the White House by the time I was 15. And that experience exposed me to people in Washington that had many different jobs, but a lot that were connected to government. Some were lobbyists, some were politicians. And I began to see that what I was being taught in high school, how the country ran and how things got done, was very different than the liquid handshake that I was underscoring while I was playing piano bar on the K Street corridor in Washington, D.C.
So you just, almost like a fly on the wall listening to the politics happening around you and couldn't help but be like, what's happening here?
Yeah, and having conversations with people from both sides of the aisle, mm-hmm. and asking questions, being allowed to ask questions at the time, where asking questions, I wasn't called a nasty woman. Mm-hmm. Even though people would disagree with each other, and sometimes, voices would raise a little bit because they were passionate. It wasn't an atmosphere at the time that it is now. Mm-hmm. And so I was able to learn a lot, and I became passionate about how the country's run, and that I thought everybody needed to care about that.
Mhm.
As the years have gone on, I've been exposed to different things like you have, but maybe I've been on tour.
Mhm.
So the book talks about being challenged, for example, after 9/11,
Yeah.
and being the first music on David Letterman, and the responsibility, what song to play, what I was seeing in the country. I traveled from New York City. I'd been there on 9/11, and I traveled there to Florida to see my baby daughter and husband on a bus, and was called that I needed to come back. And so seeing in the country that the country wasn't ready for war, that's not what I saw. I saw truck drivers coming over to hug us, hearing that we had come from New York. And there was something so, there was a grieving, but it wasn't, the country wasn't yet ready for war. And I began to see the importance, how politicians can try and steer the narrative, and how it's so important for writers and artists to also make sure that the narrative, the correct narrative, is out there.
Mhm. You have really tried to push your narrative, your personal narrative, and at times you've had pushback. Particularly, I want to talk about Little Earthquakes, which is the album that I came to know you, listen to, and that was an album that was rejected by the label that you were a part of at that time. And I think I want to know kind of how you handled that, because this was in 1990, so this was a while ago, but it still talks about the place that women and women's issues have in our culture and in this industry. And so I want to know how you handled that, but also what advice you would give to someone if that happened to them today.
It was very challenging because when I presented the first draft of Little Earthquakes and it did get rejected, the solution that was offered was mute the pianos and insert the guitars. Now, I knew as a pianist that that was artistic death for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so two things happened. I needed to try and drill down the note. What was the problem? Clearly, I wasn't going to apply that solution.
Mm-hmm.
So it took a while. I write it in the book with the muses talking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And they took me back to my training in Washington when I would play a congressional party, or I would be playing some kind of event. And the tone would have been made clear to me, the tone I needed to hold for that event. So that was my job, to hold the tone. And what the muses tried to get me to understand, and showing my life in Washington and how I dealt with those challenging situations, was these guys were asking for a different tone.
Mm-hmm.
So I offered up more material that I designed in a different way. And I wouldn't call it a compromise, I'd call it an expansion.
Okay.
And the key here is to try and understand, when you're on contract with a label and they're holding all the cards. The only card I had was, I'm not going to desecrate the songs that exist. This is who they are. But I can design other songs that I respect equally, and try and expand the project.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to do that. And I added 6 different tracks that hadn't existed before, one of them being a song called Me and a Gun, that the label didn't want me to put on either. But
Mm-hmm.
I stood by that and just said, they said, this is a very uncomfortable song. I said, well, it's supposed to be.
Right.
And if you're not uncomfortable, there's something wrong with you.
Absolutely. I didn't know this, but when I was reading it, that Silent All These Years is one of the songs that's most important to you. And you wrote it around the time of the Anita Hill hearings. I am of the age where I watched those hearings also, and they changed my life. And years later, you said that the busiest day at RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest, national network, which you are integral part of. The busiest day at RAIN was the day after Christine Blasey Ford testified that she had been assaulted by now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. um, I found that that connection really breathtaking. So could you please discuss those two moments for us?
When Silent All These Years came out, it came out about a month after the Anita Hill hearing. And when it came out, when I had originally written it, it was an expression about women in the 90s finding their voice. Anita Hill said, and we all saw it, something to the effect, she could stay silent no more. And in that time, when you've written a work and it merges with something that's happening on a national level or a global level, you realize that your song might become part of something that you didn't realize it would be part of when you wrote it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think years and years later, hearing from RAIN the unbelievable response from people, that people were enraged and they found their voice. People in the military, there's part of the hotline that's dedicated 24 hours to the military.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes, and hearing the amount of calls that were coming in from around the world on that side, and then hearing people that found it for the first time, some of them, to acknowledge the assault that happened to them after Dr. Ford spoke.
Right. She unleashed something inside of a lot of us that may have been kept down, maybe even since, the Anita Hill hearings, and it just exploded. And I that time period is going to go down as a crucial turning point, I believe. So you've been in the music business for 40 years. How has it changed over that time? Or has it not?
Okay, so there was a time when radio was everything, and advertisers for radio could have pull with what got played. At alternative radio in the 90s, I'll never forget being told, we're playing two women already, and that's too many. So, you're at that time, the women during that time, it was a constant battle of trying to get played on the radio and then yet realizing, well, but okay, I'm not a mainstream artist, but this is the avenue. And I think there was so much weight put on the importance of radio over press and print. Mm-hmm. And yet I decided, okay, I'm going in the print route and the press route and make sure that I'm able to be available if anybody wants to have conversations, journalists, and have discussions. And that really opened things up, embracing the print side. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, we have other ways of hearing our music and getting music. So it's not just the power of the radio. Mm-hmm. And radio choosing sometimes to blackball or block artists if they don't like the message because the advertisers won't put the money into the station if, say they're right-wing and anti-choice and they don't want a feminist message. So all this was the backdrop of what was going on, that with the internet, you can circumvent.
I know, but that seems to have lasted for a long time, the kind of looking at women artists and not putting them on the radio or having too many women, which is actually quite similar to what happened with women directors, which was, oh, we already hired a woman, she didn't work out, we're never hiring another woman again. It's the same kind of cycle, but it's in a different area of the creative industry. And I think this is important for people to understand is It's like it happens everywhere.
Yes, it happens everywhere. And it's still
Um,
happening. So that's why I wanted to be part of Carla, and I was so grateful to be asked to be part, because I do think that, we have to be aware of these opportunities, that sometimes the doors are closed because the boys club likes to work with who they want to work with. And it's not castigating the guys. I love the guys on my crew. I work with many men, but
right,
it's also, though, that women have something of value.
right.
That we do have something of value, and we can be part of your team, and we can,
And
I
we're
think,
half the
be good
world.
collaborators.
So let's go talking about the title of your new memoir. It's called Resistance, and that seems to be kind of what your music is a resistance. So talk about why you picked that title.
I loved the title. I've always been interested in the French resistance. I had uncles on both sides that fought in um, the European theater in World War II and the Pacific theater. And so the stories, particularly of my Uncle Woody, who was in Italy and France and fought, he had a couple Purple Hearts. And he would talk to me about the civilians and the bravery of the French and the British, of course. And I was really just drawn to that word my whole life. And when I started thinking about it, whether we're resisting tyranny or we must resist the authoritarians who are trying to destroy our democratic system. Two, through the pandemic, resisting despondency, that I would be getting letters when I was doing these virtual book signings from people saying, T, I'm really having a hard time creating because I can't see when anything I'm going to create. When are we going to play live music again?
Right, right. I
So,
know.
it was a place of, well, we can't just capitulate to that.
And you're used to touring, so you were about to take the book on the road and tour with the book, and you had to pivot like everyone else did into these kind of virtual conversations. And were you able to get the message out to people about the resistance that we all need to be living in right now?
Yes, I think the virtual book signings and these conversations like we're having um, were effective. And I also had to cancel the music tour, which was
Mhm.
going to go. Tickets were going to go up in early May, but we kind of recognized in early April. I have a sister who is a doctor, and she says that's not going to happen. So open your eyes. And so therefore, we were going to be out there and holding a place for people to come before the election to have music and a gathering. The community's always been really good about that, gathering together and supporting each other. So we've had to, accept that that's not going to happen. We can't play live music in that way with audiences at this time.
Right. So we live in a really scary moment in our history, and you're in the UK during your quarantine. I'm in upstate New York. I am in Trump country. We see a lot of Trump signs here where I'm living during the pandemic quarantine. My friend and I, we put up a Black Lives Matter sign and on the lawn, and we're just, we're standing in opposition to the authoritarianism that's creeping into our country. So today we're recording this again Tuesday on August 18th, which is the 100th anniversary of white women getting the vote. And, voting, Michelle Obama last night on the Democratic convention talked about voting. And I've always voted, voting is like a holiday for me. But what kind of messages do you want to send, particularly to young women who look up to you, who, might not feel that they want to engage in politics, like they're just done with it, they want to blow the whole thing up? What would you say to them about the importance of using their franchise?
Okay. So just last week, I was talking with some German writers, and they said to me, Tori, why can't America look at Germany in the 30s? Why can't you all see what could potentially be happening? Yes, a variation on the theme, but musicians, we understand that. Writers, we understand that. But
Right.
everybody, we have a blueprint in history for tyranny, for show trials, for writers being sent to the Gulag in the Soviet Union. Those stories are out there. So why we can't see what's happening before our eyes? This is not a time to be passive. You could lose your whole life. You could lose your right to speak out. And sometimes I do think it is difficult when you're in a cataclysm like the pandemic, and it seems so chaotic, but we have to find ways to say, okay, I'm not going to bury my head in the sand or pull the covers over my head. This is my time.
Right.
This is my time. This is our time in history where democracy isn't a given. It's not an entitlement. It's something that our ancestors fought for and came over from, other shores to be part of because they didn't want to live in an aristocracy. They didn't, and we're looking at an economic aristocracy that doesn't want you or your children to be educated, to be anything really but a serf. So a variation on serfdom. So that boot coming down on anybody that isn't here.
Yeah. So last question, talk a little bit about the role of the artist at this moment in our culture.
Well, there's an opportunity, isn't there, for artists to, yes, some are there to help us escape for a moment, but then others are there to document, to reflect back to us what we're feeling, all these different emotions. Some of them are really scary and intimidating. And so therefore, we do have an opportunity. Those who might have thought, well, people say the music is too heavy or my subject matter, the network won't like it. Well, the network might not like it, but the public is thirsty. They're thirsty for important conversations, and they want to be heard too, and we need to listen to them.
Any last message you want to share with people?
We're voting for a system of government, an authoritarian one or a democratic one.
Simple. It's very simple. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Melissa.
Please stay safe, healthy, and we look forward to hearing your songs again in the near future.